Mark Meirowitz, who's a professor at State University at New York Maritime College, joining us live from New York. Professor, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Well, this is not New York City and this is not Florida. This is a very different arena that Donald Trump is entering into now. And this really seems above the previous two indictments concerning hush money and concerning the documents he took down to Mar-a-Lago. This seems to get to the heart of the matter and the heart of the Justice Department's complaint about Donald Trump. This must be much more of a threat to the former president than the previous two cases.
Well, first of all, let's distinguish between the other cases. And I think that is a point that has been missed by many commentators. The Stormy Daniels case in New York, which is regarding hush money, that relates to a period before the president took office, before Trump was in office. The classified documents mishandling case relates to activity the president or ex-president is accused of after he was president. This case in D.C. goes directly to what the president did while he was in office. That's why this case is a pivotal case. Important to look at the indictment, which I have. What is not in the indictment? Number one, nothing about the riot on January 6th. There's nothing about that, nothing. And the reason for that is that it is fairly clear that under the Supreme Court, under the law, incitement to a riot requires incitement to imminent lawless action. And probably they felt they couldn't bring this case. Furthermore, in the cases brought against the rioters themselves, Trump himself was not accused in those proceedings as being involved as an unindicted co-conspirator, anything like that. So that one's not there. And that's really the crux of what this is about. If you look at the indictment, it has a number of very, I think, creative and very new ideas that need to be tested in the courts. And here is the point. This case in D.C. is going to the Supreme Court. No question. Why? Because it relates to the function of the U.S. president while he is in office and the question whether a president can be indicted and convicted for his activities while he is president. And that is a very debatable point under Supreme Court law. What the Supreme Court has held is that presidents can, this came up in the Nixon, Watergate, etc., can be held criminally liable for activities outside or in the perimeter outside of their power and scope of their activities. But in this case, Trump may argue, I argued that the election wasn't fair, or I argued about the Electoral College. I argued all kinds of things that I did within the scope of being president. That's a tough, tough issue. So there's a lot of really complicated legal issues here also, and here is the bottom line. We're in the middle of an election season, and guess what? Trump is the leading contender in the Republican Party. I think the latest number was 54%, way ahead of all his opponents, including Vice President Pence, who is at a very low numbers, 2%, 3%, and may not even qualify for the Republican debate. Yet Pence is the linchpin of this case. I'm not saying Pence is saying anything untoward, but he's a contender against President Trump for the Republican nomination. This case has the potential of stretching, upending the entire American system, especially in an election year where we want the voters and society to be focusing on the contenders. Who will they be? Maybe Trump and Biden. Can you imagine that election where you're going to have Trump running for president, Biden running for president, and what is the House saying? What are the Republicans in the House saying? You're covering it. They're saying they're going to impeach Biden. So just think about 2024. Impeachment proceedings in the House to impeach Biden and hearings, and Trump going to court. That is not an optimal scenario for the American constitutional system. It's extremely sad that we're in this situation. And honestly, it's just imploding potentially our entire system, and it's very problematic, clearly.
Well, Mike, during the evening, I'd like to talk to you about, this idea of political dysfunction in the US and that international judgment on that. But first of all, you mentioned Vice President or former Vice President Mike Pence, who now seems to be very much a potential witness for the prosecution, the kind of things he's been saying in interviews running up to this case, talking about Trump and his gaggle of lunatic lawyers and all the rest of it. So it does seem that it's not just going to be a matter of judges making up their minds about whether or not these threats to the electoral system came from the former White House team, but also there's going to be some powerful witnesses out there giving testimony against the former president. Now, that may sway things to an extent, do you not think?
I think it's debatable. I'll tell you why. Because the question that came up was when Trump was trying to convince Pence to take away the electoral votes or not count electoral votes. That is really a linchpin of this case. But the truth of the matter is that the Congress saw this as a perhaps a questionable or as a gray area because Congress changed the electoral vote count procedure to minimize the authority of the vice president. Now, one could argue, indeed, one of my students in my constitutional law class argued and said to me, well, wait a minute, professor, wait, if the electoral vote count was so clear and the vice president's authority was so clear, then how come they had to pass a law to make it clear that the vice president didn't have the authority to change the electoral votes? I'm not saying that he did, but I don't think it's a settled point of law. Look, the way the electoral votes have been counted, and people don't really remember that in the 2016 election, in January 2017, when the votes were counted in the Congress in the joint session, guess what? The Democrats protested Trump's election on the basis of Russian collusion. You can look this up. It's on the web. You can see it. So there have been challenges to the electoral votes in the past, challenges that were deemed to be perfectly legal and appropriate. I'm not saying that what was done here was appropriate, legal. That's for the decision of the judge and the jury and so forth in the appeals courts that are definitely going to look at this case. But it isn't simple, and it isn't a slam dunk, and it isn't clear as can be. The other point is, which is where we are in a bit of a confusion, is that in the conspiracy cases that are named here, they're all conspiracy cases, they have not named any official conspirators. They have named unindicted co-conspirators, which the media now speculates and thinks it might be Giuliani and Eastman and these other people. But here's Trump's point, and this is a very important point. Trump's point is, well, you name these people as unindicted co-conspirators. You said I committed a conspiracy with them, so I want to call them as witnesses so we can flesh it out. But the problem is, they're unindicted co-conspirators. Are they going to be available to testify in this case? So there are a lot of ramifications, and here's the ramification of the most important element of this, the timing of it. Some have posited that why this was done, and I have no idea, is to move the case along so it moves along quickly with all these other cases in 2024 before the election. And that's where this becomes very problematic. And I'm not going to the merits of the cases at all, but is it correct from society's point of view to have cases pending against the former president about including the scope of the president's actions in his presidency while that person is running for president and suppose Trump is the Republican nominee? You know, it's interesting. Trump's tweet that he just tweeted this afternoon was, I need just one more indictment, and then I'm going to win the presidency. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine the system being pressured in this way? It's astonishing, really.
Indeed, very interesting thoughts, Professor Meirowitz. We'll be coming back